All right, how's everybody doing today? Welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we try to unravel some great theories of everything and, give you a little bit of a guideline about how to use these things in your own life, helping you with your paradigm shifting, your awakening to 5D consciousness, and your formation of a holistic worldview. Today is our 556th video that we've done on Dewey B. Larson and his reciprocal system of theory. And today we are in the middle of chapter 15 of his book on economics that is called The Road to Permanent Prosperity. And this chapter is called Money and Credit. And we'll get into that in a second. Now, just to let you know about Mr. Larson, he has a generalized theory of everything known as the reciprocal system, or the universe of motion. Larson is a pioneering scientist in terms of trying to construct a universe based on motion, not on matter, not on energy, but on motion. Larson's first postulate states that the universe is composed entirely of one component, motion, existing in 3 dimensions in discrete units and with 2 reciprocal aspects, space and time. So the universe is made out of motion, and motion is the relationship between space and time, which implies a reciprocal relationship. You can see that in speed. I was running at 10 miles per hour, 10 miles of space and 1 hour of time. Space over time is speed. Larson applies that to all of our scientific quantities. They are all forms of motion, and they are all expressible in exclusively space or time terms with a fraction. Space or time as the numerator, time or space as the denominator. All of our scientific quantities like matter and energy and force and pressure and electric charge and magnetic flux and permeability and viscosity and power, and all of those things are simply fractions with space or time as the numerator and time or space as the denominator. Space or time can have multiple exponents, so you can have things like density, time to the 3rd power over space to the 6th power, or pressure, time over space to the 4th power. Larson also, when he is speaking of motion, he's speaking in a little bit more generic terms, what he calls scalar motion, a motion that has a magnitude but has no specific direction. You can envision a scalar motion using a balloon. And if you put a bunch of dots on that balloon with a magic marker and blow up the balloon, you will notice that all of the dots are moving away from each other. Every dot is moving away from every other dot, meaning that every dot is moving in every direction. So there is no specific direction on that motion. It's either just basically out or in. If you're blowing the balloon out, the dots are moving outward. If you're contracting the balloon, it's inward. Those are the 2 fundamental motions in Larson's system. Larson calls the former the progression, and the latter is gravitation. The progression is omnipresent and eternal. It's always existing. Things are always moving apart at 1 unit of space per 1 unit of time, or otherwise known as the speed of light, at all times, in all places. And that is the source of everything in the universe. And that source can only be harnessed by reversing it through various means. And so that progression of the natural reference system is what he calls it. That is feels like absolutely nothing. Okay, that is, there is an outward motion that is constant and always occurring. It's kind of like being a fish in water. You don't know that you're in water. And we don't know that we're in the progression. It's something that we can't detect. But we can see its effects when we are not in the progression, or when we reverse the effects of the progression. And that is really like the formation of matter, that inward motion of the balloon. That would be the reverse of that. That's called gravity. And that is the prerequisite for mass. So in order to get to gravity, we have to reverse the progression in 3 dimensions. And Larson describes that whole process in some of his books on physics and chemistry and astronomy. Larson also has a book on metaphysics. And today we're looking at his books on economics. One of his books on economics, The Road to Permanent Prosperity. He has another one called The Road to Full Employment. And in these works, he takes that same idea of a universe of motion. Now he has an economic system in motion. He looks at a lot of things like rates of flow, and he has a flow chart of his economic system, and dispenses with much of the sociological economics, which is more based on political preference, and sets it up more like a science that is, based on the principles of science, and that you have to construct an economic system that is viable. Just like if you were constructing a bridge or a house, it has to comply with the laws of physics, or else it's going to collapse. Then once you've mastered that, then you can start putting in the, the preferences. And Larson boils it down to the most basic principles of, the most basic principle is work or starve. You have to produce something, and those are the 2 reciprocal aspects in the economic equation of production and consumption. And Larson forms a number of different principles that he says are mathematically, scientifically precise and exact, and kind of goes from there. He's able to construct a system, and he feels like he can regulate the economy. The booms and busts of the economy can be regulated through manipulating the reservoirs, or the storage. I guess you would call them banks or money reservoirs. And by manipulating the amount of money that's being put into or taken out of reservoirs, you can kind of even out the business cycle to avoid going into deep depressions and so on. He explains that as we go through the rest of the book, but let's get started here in the middle of chapter 15 on money and credit. And if you'd like to get more detailed description of the reciprocal system, probably watch one of my first 474 videos on the subject. I go into it a little bit more deeply. And if you want to go back to the start of this book, go back about 5 weeks and start with chapter 1. But this is coming from chapter 15. The significant quantity is the amount of money in storage, the size of the bank's reserves. A deposit by a customer of the bank is an input into storage. It increases the reserves. A withdrawal from the customer's account is an output from storage. It decreases the reserves. A deposit set up by means of a bank loan is a balance transaction that is neither an input or an output. The loan withdraws money from bank storage. but the return of this money to storage by means of the deposit completely nullifies all that was accomplished by the original withdrawal, and the bank reserves are not altered. Here again, it is essential to keep in mind that the absolute quantity of the circulating medium has no significance. It is the rate of flow in the circulating system that is important, and banking transactions affect the general operation of the economy only to the extent that they alter this rate of flow. The cooling system analogy will be helpful in getting a clear view of this situation. If we add water to a reservoir in this system, in the cooling system of an engine, and it stays in the reservoir, then there is no change in the significant item, the rate of water flow. Under these conditions, the added water has no effect on the cooling operation. It must leave the reservoir if it is to accomplish anything. This point is of sufficient importance to justify stating it as another of the general principles of economic science. Principle number 14. The quantity of money existing within an economic system has no effect on prices or on the general operation of the system, except insofar as the method by which money is introduced into or withdrawn from the system may constitute a purchasing power reservoir transaction. The existing confusion in this area is largely a result of the quantity theory of money, which is widely accepted in the economic circles and has considerable influence on the thinking of many of those who do not subscribe to the theory as a whole. Basically, this theory rests on the premise that the quantity of money in existence is exchanged for the quantity of goods in existence, and consequently any increase in the amount of money necessitates paying out more money for the same goods. The backers of the theory visualize a supply of money and a demand for money, analogous to the supply and demand for wheat. And they deduce that an increase in the supply of money relative to the demand for wheat will unquestionably cause a drop in the price of wheat. The flaw in this logic is, of course, that the premise is false. The basic economic process is not an exchange of goods for money. It is an exchange of goods for goods. Money only enters into the process as an intermediary, and since it is not changed in any way by the functions which it carries out, it can be used over and over again without limit. There is no demand for money in terms of quantity. It is entirely immaterial whether we use $10 once or $1 10 times. Hence, we can have any price level with any amount of money, subject only to the qualification that we must have enough money available to provide a working supply for each unit participating in the economic process. Similarly, we must have enough water in the cooling system to reach all of the parts that are to be cooled. But aside from this limitation, it is immaterial whether we have only a few extra gallons in the circulating system or are connected to reservoirs containing thousands of gallons. If we have only a small amount, it makes the circuit frequently. If we have a greater amount, it simply moves more slowly. The original or crude version of the quantity theory of money has been abandoned by most economists because it is very evident that the rate at which the existing supply of money is being used, the velocity of circulation, is equally as important as the absolute quantity of money that is available. Present-day opinion among those who subscribe to this theory generally favors one version or another of the so-called equation of exchange, which was expressed by Irving Fisher as MV equals TP, where M is the quantity of money, V is the velocity of circulation, T is the volume of trade in units, and P is the average price per unit. MV equals TP. There can hardly be any question as to the mathematical validity of this equation. If we multiply the value of the existing stock of money by the number of times this stock was used during a specified period, we arrive at the total money value of the transactions during this period. Then if we multiply the total number of trade units involved in these transactions by the average price per unit, we must necessarily arrive at the same total. But the meaning of this equation is another matter. The conclusion which the supporters of the quantity theory draw from it, the conclusion that the price P is a function of the quantity of money M, is totally unwarranted. As long as V is free to vary, which is true now, and will continue to be true as long as the use of money continues to follow anything like the present practice, price is a function of MV, not of M alone. As it happens, there is an equation of exactly the same kind in the physical field. Indeed, it is identical with the equation of exchange, except in the letter symbols that are used, and a comparison of the conclusions which the economists draw from their equation with those which the scientists draw from exactly the same equation provides a graphic illustration of the reason why the attempts that have been made by economists to apply scientific methods to their field have been so uniformly unsuccessful. The equation which represents the behavior of the general properties of gases, the general gas equation as it is called, is expressed as PV equals RT. If scientists employed the same reasoning as the economists, they would deduce from the gas equation that the gas volume V is determined by the temperature T. But we do not do any such thing. On the contrary, we recognize that the pressure P is free to vary. The gas can occupy any volume at any temperature within the range of values in which the equation is applicable. In this instance, as in so many others, the economists have adopted a scientific form, but do not apply the scientific reasoning without which the form is useless. And consequently, they arrive at conclusions that are totally different from those which the scientist draws from the same premises. Most modern economists realize that there is something wrong with the quantity theory of money. Keynes, for instance, comments plaintively on, quote, the extreme complexity of the relationship between prices and the quantity of money when we attempt to express it in a formal manner. Samuelson points out correctly that the key issue is whether V is constant, and notes that, quote, one of the tenets of monetarism is that V is relatively stable and predictable. As he no doubt realizes, there is no evidence to support this conclusion. It is simply an assumption introduced to reconcile the equation of exchange with the products of supply and demand reasoning. The Federal Reserve publication previously quoted has this to say, quote, in assessing the effect on economic activity of changes in the money supply, it is important to recognize that there is no simple automatic measure of the appropriate relationship between the amount of money outstanding and the level of economic activity. A given volume of money, for example, can be associated with either higher or lower levels of spending. That is, can finance more or fewer transactions depending on how often it is used. End quote. Here we have at least a partial recognition of the fact brought out in the previous discussion that any volume of business at any price level can be financed by any quantity of money as long as there is enough money on hand to reach all individuals who have use for it. just as any quantity of water can accomplish the task of cooling the engine as long as there is enough water in the system to reach all of the parts that are to be cooled. But few of the present-day experts are willing to give up the idea that the quantity theory of money must have something to do with the situation, and even the statement quoted above, which cuts the ground out from under the quantity theory as a whole, still implies that some appropriate relation exists. The credence given the quantity theory of money is, in spite of its lack of validity, stems largely from the observation that substantial increases in the money supply almost invariably do increase the flow of consumer purchasing power and therefore do raise prices. Those who have noted these price increases or decreases have jumped to the conclusion that the variations in the quantity of money are the cause of the price changes. This kind of reasoning, concluding that since B follows A, it must have been caused by A, is a well-known logical fallacy. There is no assurance that such a conclusion is valid. In the case under consideration, it is completely in error. Increases in the quantity of money raise prices only to the extent that they add to the stream of money purchasing power flowing to the markets. New money that is not used in this way has no effect on the price level. If it goes directly into bank reserves, for example, it has the same status as if it had not been issued at all. It is merely stored in a different reservoir. The reason why most injections of new money into the system are inflationary is that the new money is almost always created for the purpose of providing additional money purchasing power for governments or individuals who wish to buy more goods than they have money to pay for. This means that the new money goes immediately into the markets and does raise prices. Nevertheless, it is not the creation of additional money that causes the inflation. It is the increase in the flow of money purchasing power, the effect of which is no different from that of an increased flow resulting from withdrawal of existing money from bank storage. Credit transactions increase active purchasing power only to the extent that the money thus made available gets out into the purchasing power stream. That is, constitutes a new withdrawal from the money reservoirs. The measure of the additions to the current flow of money purchasing power due to bank transactions is neither the total loans, which are reservoir outputs, nor the total deposits, which are reservoir inputs. But the difference between the two, the net change in the bank reserves, except as additional credit money may be issued, this difference between loans and deposits cannot exceed the amount of liquid capital put into the bank by its owners. It follows that bank credit as such, exclusive of the transactions that depend on the issuance of credit money, does not draw upon new money purchasing power. It is merely a device whereby money already existing as bank capital and deposits can be withdrawn from storage and put to current use. This means that bank credit by itself is not inherently a disturbing factor in economic life. On the contrary, it serves to some degree as a dampener of the fluctuations that would otherwise be caused by variations in the amount of money storage. But the economic effect of bank credit has been completely changed by the adoption of practices that make it possible to vary the amount of credit money issued through the banks practically without limit. The term credit money, as herein applied, refers to any medium used for monetary purposes that does not constitute money in its own right, intrinsic money, and is not a representation thereof, token money. Currency is token money to the extent that it is covered by intrinsic money in the vaults of the issuing agency. It is credit money to the extent that it is not so covered. Coins are intrinsic money to the extent that the metal of which they are composed would be accepted as money without the imprint. They are credit money to the extent that value is added by the imprint. Here we meet one of those curious theories so abundant in economics, which are based on assumptions that are obviously unsound when they are isolated and subjected to examination, yet have such attractive prospects of getting something for nothing that they are continually cropping up in one form or another and are seldom without a substantial body of support. There is one school of thought which objects to a classification such as that set forth in the preceding paragraph on the ground that currency backed by any other kind of tangible value is just as sound as currency backed by gold, and is the full equivalent of the latter. In its simpler forms, this monetary theory is usually associated with the name of John Law, a Scottish financier of the 18th century. Even in that day, the general public, finding themselves without money enough to buy everything that they would like to have, had lost sight of the fact that it was their inability to produce more goods that was limiting their purchasing power, and were blaming the shortage on an insufficient supply of money. It had already been demonstrated by costly experiments that simply printing additional money without adequate backing was disastrous. So much attention was being given to devising other means of accomplishing the same end. John Law argued that land, for instance, is just as truly an item of value as gold, and therefore currency backed by land values would be just as sound as currency backed by gold. In either case, the currency is only a claim against the underlying values. As might be expected, Law did not get a chance to experiment with his theories in conservative Scotland, but transferred his base of operations to France, and for a time was highly successful. Finally, his activities culminated in a wild orgy of speculation in the shares of one of his companies whose assets consisted mainly of concessions in the French possessions in the New World. Speculative values in what is now known as the Mississippi Bubble reached astronomical heights and collapsed just as completely when the bubble burst, bringing widespread ruin in France and disaster to John Law. Since that time, Lawism, the issuing of money on the basis of values other than metallic money, has generally been regarded as basically unsound. For the purpose of clarifying the relation of the credit process to the operation of the economic mechanism, however, it is desirable that we should recognize just where John Law's theory was defective. If the holder of conceivable gold-backed currency decides that he wants something more tangible and turns it in for gold, the transaction is closed at that point. He has received what he wanted, and no value is lost in the exchange, even if many other currency holders decide to do the same thing at the same time. But if the currency is backed by land values, the holder is not through when he has converted it into the ownership of a parcel of land. Land is not money and is not accepted as such. In order to obtain a form of purchasing power that is readily usable, it is necessary to sell the land. And this introduces a very large element of uncertainty into the transaction. There is no assurance that the land can be sold for an amount equal to the face value of the currency. On the contrary, it is all too likely that forced sales by those wanting to convert their currency into intrinsic money will seriously depress the price level, with the possibility of a panic always just around the corner. The fallacy in Law's theory lies in its assumption that a representation of a physical commodity or asset has properties which that commodity or asset itself does not possess. When we get down to fundamentals, it is clear that currency based on a commodity can constitute money only to the extent that the commodity itself constitutes money. Currency based on gold is money because gold is accepted as money. Currency based on land is not money because land is not accepted as money. It is true that currency ostensibly based on land may be accepted as money for a time, but this is not because it is backed by land values. It is because the credit of the issuing agency stands behind it. In the final analysis, currency backed by anything other than intrinsic money rests upon credit. As long as the credit of the issuing agency is good, that is, as long as the public has confidence that the currency will be accepted at its face value as money, the currency is also good. But when that credit falters, the currency goes down with it, regardless of the backing that it is supposed to have. An interesting point in this connection is that the Federal Reserve notes, the principal U.S. currency, are money of the John Law type. To the extent that this currency has any backing at all, aside from the credit of the U.S. government, it is issued on the strength of commercial credit instruments, which are rediscounted by the member banks of the system. This is John Law's plan in slightly different dress. It is successful in this instance only because the government credit is good. Okay, I think we're going to stop right there for today. And maybe some of our government Federal Reserve people, Janet Yellen or somebody like that might be listening, and but who knows? Probably not. And we're going to see what happens to our money here coming up very soon. But in the meantime, thanks for tuning in today, and have a